The 10th century, a time spoken of in whispers, is spoken of at all. Historians once called it the Iron Century, others the Saeculum Obscurum, the Age of Darkness. Imagine a world where knowledge flickered like a dying candle, where kingdoms rose and fell with barely a trace, and where entire decades slipped into silence. The chronicles we rely upon for the Middle Ages grow thin, sparse, or deliberately distorted. So the question lingers, what really happened in those 100 years? This was no golden age of progress. It was an age where emperors were strangled in their sleep, where the papacy became a puppet of powerful Roman families, where Viking raiders carved kingdoms out of foreign soil, and where famine and plague stalked the powerless. To live in the 10th century was to live on the edge of oblivion. But the strangeness goes deeper than chaos and bloodshed. Some scholars have argued that the 10th century itself may never have existed. According to what is known as the phantom time hypothesis, 3 entire centuries, most of the 7th, 8th, and 9th, were fabricated, perhaps by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, or even by Pope Sylvester II. Their aim? To place themselves at the dawn of the year 1000, an age they imagined would herald the apocalypse and the rebirth of Christendom. If the theory is true, our calendars are wrong. The year we call 2025 might not be 2025 at all. It could be 1728. Strange, isn't it? 100 years that might be a shadow, a century that may have never existed. But whether fabricated or not, the records we do have of the 10th century show a Europe unlike anything before or after, a century when power was fractured, when the church itself drowned in scandal, and when ordinary people fought desperately just to survive. The strange truth about the 10th century is this. It was not a time of knights and castles, nor of progress and learning. It was a century of collapse, of forgetting, and of shadows. A century that still dares us to ask if time itself was rewritten. If the 10th century had a beating heart, it was Rome, but it was a Rome in decay. The eternal city was no longer the empire's shining capital, but fractured husk of ruins and power struggles. And in this chaos, the papacy, the very institution meant to shepherd Christendom, fell under control of 2 Roman noble women, Theodora and her daughter Marozia. Historians call this period the Pronocracy, the rule of the harlots. For nearly 60 years, the papacy was little more than a family prize. Popes were installed not for their holiness, but because they were sons, lovers, or pawns of these women and their clan. Pope John XII, a teenager when he ascended the throne of St. Peter, turned the Lateran Palace into something resembling a brothel. He gambled, seduced wives and widows, and even toasted the devil during drunken feasts. Chroniclers recorded that he was so corrupt that he died violently in bed, struck down by the husband of a woman he was seducing. And yet, this was not merely scandal. It was instability at the core of European faith. If the church was rotten, what hope did kings or peasants have? Who could they trust when even the vicar of Christ seemed little more than a pawn in a family feud? To the average believer, the world must have felt like it was spiraling into sin and ruin. Perhaps this is why whispers of the approaching year 1000 carried such dread. Perhaps people truly believed the end of days was near. The Pronocracy was not simply a scandal. It was a symptom, a sign of a century where nothing felt stable, where power passed from one hand to another not by law or faith, but by violence, lust, and deceit. As the papacy drowned in corruption, Europe's borders were battered by storms of steel. To the north came the Vikings, raiders turned conquerors, who carved kingdoms into England, Ireland, and even Normandy and France. They sailed not just rivers but the open seas, reaching as far as Spain, North Africa, and Constantinople. Imagine the terror of hearing a horn echo across the water at dawn, knowing the dragon-proud ships were already in sight. From the east came the Magyars, fierce horsemen sweeping out of the Hungarian plain. They struck like lightning, burning villages across Italy, Germany, and France. To medieval peasants, these riders seemed less like men and more like demons, appearing suddenly, vanishing into horizon, leaving only ashes behind. And from the south came the Saracens, Muslim raiders who struck the coast of Italy, Sicily, and even Switzerland, climbing the Alpine passes to plunder far beyond the Mediterranean. They established bases on European soil, forcing kings and dukes to pay them tribute just to buy a fragile peace. To live in the 10th century was to live surrounded by enemies. No village was safe, no kingdom secure. The collapse of the old Carolingian Empire left the continent fragmented into dozens of petty states, each too weak to resist the tide. To the people of the time, it must have felt as though God had abandoned them, and that every horizon carried the promise of fire and death. If Europe seemed powerless, it was because kings themselves were powerless. The mighty empire Charlemagne, built in the 9th century, had shattered like glass. His heirs squabbled, divided, and betrayed one another until his empire was nothing more than a memory. In France, kings ruled in name only, while local lords built their own castles and enforced their own laws. In Germany and Italy, noble families plotted endlessly, sometimes crowning rival emperors, sometimes murdering them outright. The 10th century was a time when kingship meant little unless you could hold it by the sword. Dynasties collapsed in a heartbeat. In England, kings were assassinated by their own kin. Edward the Martyr slain by a knife thrust while dismounting his horse, his killer supported by nobles who wanted a weaker ruler. In Germany, kings fought desperately to reclaim their authority, only to find themselves besieged by Magyar raids or betrayed by rival dukes. It was a century where no throne was secure, where the crown was less a symbol of divine right and more a curse, painting a target on the wearer's head. For ordinary people, the instability of kingship meant endless taxes, wars, and shifting allegiances. For the nobility, it meant opportunity. Power could be seized, lands taken, blood spilled, with little consequence. In this vacuum of authority, Europe fragmented. Castles rose on hilltops, their towers symbols of fear rather than protection. The great empire of Charlemagne was gone, and in its place a patchwork of warlords. Order, it seemed, had vanished from the earth. And yet, out of this chaos, a figure emerged, Otto the Great of Saxony. Crowned king of Germany in 936, Otto was more than just a warrior. He was a survivor in a century that devoured rulers whole. He crushed rival dukes, defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, and re-established a vision of empire that had been lost since Charlemagne. Otto's reign marked a turning point, a brief flicker of order in an age of shadows. When he marched into Italy and forced the Pope to crown him Holy Roman Emperor, it seemed as though the chaos of the century might finally give way to stability. For the first time in generations, the invaders had been checked, and the authority of a single ruler was once again felt across Central Europe. But Otto's empire was fragile. It depended not on strong institutions, but on his personal will and military might. After his death, the old instability returned, though his dynasty, the Ottonians, would cling to power for another century. Still, Otto remains one of the few bright figures of the 10th century, a man who wrestled briefly with chaos and forced it, however briefly, to obey. His story reminds us of the strangeness of this age. In a time when so much seemed broken beyond repair, one man could still rise, gather strength, and reshape the destiny of a continent. But what of the ordinary people? For most, the 10th century was not about popes or emperors, but about survival. Life was harsh, short, and precarious. Famine struck again and again. Harvest failed. Fields lay fallow, and entire villages starved. In some regions, desperate peasants turned to eating grass, bark, or even the flesh of the dead. Disease was ever present, though poorly understood. Fevers, plagues, and infections could sweep through a community without warning. Few reached the age of 40. Women faced the dangers of childbirth again and again, while men labored under the demands of their lords. And always there was a threat of violence, from raiders, from soldiers, from rival peasants seeking food or land. And yet, in the shadows, life endured. Monks kept the flame of learning alive in remote monasteries, copying ancient texts and preserving fragments of forgotten worlds. Farmers slowly reclaimed abandoned lands, building the foundations for the agricultural revolution that would come in later centuries. Even in the darkest of times, seeds of survival were planted. The strange truth about the 10th century is not only that it was violent and unstable, it is that humanity endured it. Through fear, famine, and fire, people still lived, loved, prayed, and dreamed. And yet, perhaps the strangest truth of all is the idea that the 10th century itself may have never existed. In 1991, the German historian Herbert Illig proposed a phantom time hypothesis. He argued that between the years 614 and 911, history had been deliberately falsified. Documents were forged, events invented, and centuries inserted that never happened. According to Illig, the year 1000 was too important to leave untouched. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II wanted to live at the dawn of the new millennium, an age pregnant with prophecy. To achieve this, Illig claims they ordered the calendar rewritten, creating centuries of phantom history that never truly occurred. Most historians reject this theory as fringe. Archaeology, dendrochronology, and independent records seem to confirm that the 10th century did, in fact, exist. And yet, the gaps in our chronicles, the strange silences, and the scarcity of artifacts still leave room for unsettling questions. If Illig was wrong, then the 10th century was simply one of the darkest, most chaotic centuries in European memory. But if he was right, then our entire understanding of time is a lie. We may not be living in the 21st century at all. We may be centuries younger than we think. The 10th century remains one of the strangest chapters in history. A century of corruption, invasion, famine, and collapse. A century where even the guardians of faith were consumed by lust and ambition. A century when kings could not hold their crowns, when whole peoples lived in fear of raiders, and when survival itself was a daily miracle. And yet it is also a century of mystery. Did it truly happen as we are told? Or are we looking at shadows on a wall, fragments of a past rewritten to suit the ambitions of men? The silence of the 10th century is haunting. It is as if the world itself paused, stumbled, and only later found its balance again. The strange truth about the 10th century is that it was both real and unreal, both history and legend, both remembered and forgotten. It is a century that challenges us to question not only what happened, but whether time itself can be trusted. When we look back at the 10th century, we are not simply peering into the past. We are staring into a void, a reminder that history is fragile, that memory can be rewritten, and that even the centuries themselves can be shadows.